Living in medieval castles was much darker and more dangerous than you thought. Today I'm revealing facts you'll never find in history books, and the last one will shock you. If you like this kind of hidden history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and share your thoughts in the comments, because it's your ideas that shape our future videos. When we think of medieval castles, a certain image immediately comes to mind. Towering stone walls, mighty gates, armored knights standing guard, and noble lords feasting in glittering halls. Castles, in our imagination, are places of power, prestige, and protection. They symbolize strength and grandeur, as if they were perfect fortresses where kings and lords lived like gods on earth. But the truth that history often hides, is far darker. Behind the thick stone walls and magnificent towers, medieval castle life was anything but glamorous. These structures were not only symbols of dominance, but also prisons of misery. Inside, countless untold stories of suffering, secrets, betrayal, and fear unfolded. For the poor and powerless, castles represented not safety, but oppression. For the nobles, life behind those walls was filled with paranoia, constant intrigue, and even filth. Hidden rooms, secret tunnels, and mysterious chambers tell us that even the wealthiest lords were terrified of betrayal and assassination. The gap between wealth and poverty within these walls was wider than the moat surrounding the castle itself. So, today, we're going to strip away the romantic illusions and uncover the hidden truths of medieval castle life. We will dive deep into the struggles of ordinary people, the haunting secrets of escape tunnels and hidden chambers, the shocking reality of medieval hygiene, and the bloody intrigues that shattered families and kingdoms. This is not the fairy tale version of the Middle Ages you've seen in movies or video games. This is the dark side, the world of fear, disease, desperation, and betrayal that existed in the shadows of towering castle walls. To understand the dark side of castle life, we must first recognize what castles truly were. They were not built to be comfortable. Castles were military fortresses, first and foremost, designed to protect the lord and his wealth while keeping peasants under strict control. Thick walls and narrow windows meant that light and fresh air were scarce inside. Rooms were damp, cold, and poorly ventilated. In winter, icy drafts swept through the halls, while in summer the stone walls trapped suffocating heat. For those who lived inside, comfort was a luxury few ever experienced. The noble families had private chambers, but even these were dim, smoky, and drafty. Peasants, servants, and soldiers often slept in crowded, dirty quarters with little more than straw on the floor. The smell of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and human waste lingered constantly. This was the reality of life in castles, survival, not luxury. We've all been fed myths about castles being centers of civilization and refinement. Tournaments, banquets, and shining nights give the impression of wealth and glory. But these were exceptions, not the norm. Banquets did take place, but they were messy, noisy, and often revolting to modern standards. Food was served in huge portions, with little regard for hygiene. Meat was often spoiled, masked with heavy spices to hide the taste. Plates were rarely washed. Bones and scraps were thrown to the floor for dogs to fight over. Disease and illness spread quickly in such conditions, yet this was considered normal castle life. As for the shining knights, behind their polished armor, knights were men who lived by violence and fear. Castles were their base of operations, where they plotted wars, extracted taxes, and often kept prisoners in dungeons so horrific that their existence alone could terrify entire villages. Inside the castle walls, trust was rare. Lords and ladies lived in constant fear of betrayal, from rival nobles, from their own guards, even from family members. Poisonings, secret plots, and political assassinations were not just stories. They were a reality of survival in the Middle Ages. This is why castles were filled with hidden passages and secret chambers. Some tunnels led outside the walls, offering a chance to escape during sieges. Others allowed spies and assassins to move unnoticed. Imagine living in a fortress where every shadow could hide a potential murderer, and every meal could be your last. Even noble families were not immune. Brothers turned against brothers, vassals betrayed lords, and queens plotted against kings. A castle was never just a home. It was a battlefield of politics, where alliances shifted like the wind. Perhaps the darkest truth of all is that castles, despite their majesty, were filthy and disease-ridden. Toilets were little more than holes in the walls, often emptying directly into the moat below. These moats, which we imagine as protective barriers, were often cesspools of waste and disease. Water was unsafe, food was poorly preserved, and medical knowledge was shockingly limited. Outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other deadly illnesses tore through castle walls just as easily as enemy soldiers. Even nobles, with all their wealth, could not escape death by disease. For servants and peasants who lived in the shadow of the castle, conditions were even worse. They toiled endlessly, often receiving little more than scraps, while enduring hunger, exhaustion, and constant fear of punishment. So why uncover these hidden truths? Because history is not just about kings and battles. It is about the real lives of people who suffered, struggled, and endured in the shadows of the past. By revealing the dark side of medieval castles, we peel away the myths and discover the human cost of power, wealth, and survival. The story of castles is not only about strength, but about fragility, not about glory, but about fear, not about fairy tales, but about the brutal reality of life behind stone walls. And as we journey through this story together, you'll see how the myths of medieval castles crumble, revealing a history far more chilling and far more fascinating than any legend ever told. Chapter 1. The struggles of ordinary people in castles. When we imagine life in medieval castles, it's tempting to focus on the grandeur of the lords and ladies. We picture noble women dressed in fine silks, feasting in great halls, and brave knights ready to defend their lands. But what about the people who kept the castles running? What about the ordinary men and women who sweat, labor, and sacrifice made life inside possible? Their story is far less romantic and far more brutal. For the majority of people inside castle walls, life was not about luxury, but survival. The vast majority of castle inhabitants were servants, peasants, guards, cooks, blacksmiths, maids, and stable workers. They lived not in comfort, but in hardship, often with little reward and endless danger. From dawn until nightfall, the ordinary people of castles toiled without rest. Servants had to carry water, chop wood, scrub floors, prepare food, and tend to their lord's every demand. Women working as maids washed clothes in freezing water, cleaned chamber pots filled with human waste, and endured harsh punishments if their work did not satisfy. Cooks worked in sweltering kitchens, surrounded by smoke, fire, and the stench of rotting meat. Blacksmiths and armorers toiled at the forge, shaping weapons and armor not for themselves, but for the knights and lords who ruled over them. For many, the castle was nothing more than a prison of labor. They were bound to the land and to the lord, unable to leave without permission. In many cases, they were not much different from slaves. One of the most striking contrasts within castles was food. Lords dined on roasted meats, fine breads, and spiced dishes imported from faraway lands. Ordinary people, on the other hand, lived on scraps. After a grand feast, servants might be allowed to gather leftovers, half-chewed bones, stale bread, and spoiled meat. Their daily diet consisted mostly of dark bread, porridge, and thin soups. Meat was rare, and often only eaten on holidays or when scraps trickled down from the lord's table. Hunger was constant. During sieges, when castles were cut off from supplies, the poor suffered first. Lords hoarded food in storerooms, ensuring their own survival, while peasants starved. Chronicles describe desperate scenes where ordinary people ate rats, dogs, and even boiled leather to survive. The image of a warm, cozy medieval castle could not be further from reality. Ordinary workers and servants often lived in dark, damp quarters, sometimes underground or in cold stone rooms without windows. Straw on the floor served as bedding, infested with lice, fleas, and rats. Winters were brutal. With little clothing and no fireplaces of their own, peasants huddled together for warmth, often sleeping beside animals for extra heat. Diseases spread easily in such crowded conditions, and hygiene? Almost non-existent. Baths were rare, water was often dirty and unsafe to drink. Chamber pots overflowed. The smell of waste, smoke, and sweat filled the air. Even within castle walls, life was a fight against filth. Ordinary people in castles lived under constant pressure to obey their masters. A servant who displeased the lord or lady could be whipped, beaten, or thrown into the dungeon. Sometimes punishments were cruel beyond belief. Ears or fingers could be cut off for stealing, and public humiliation was common. Lords and nobles often saw their servants as expendable tools rather than human beings. During sieges, ordinary people were forced to defend the walls, carry boiling oil, or repair damages under enemy fire. Their lives were seen as far less valuable than those of knights or nobles. Fear of punishment, hunger, and exhaustion hung over their lives like a shadow. For women of lower status, castle life carried an additional weight. Beyond endless housework, many faced the constant threat of abuse. Lords and knights often viewed servant women as their property, free to use as they pleased. Rape and exploitation were tragically common, yet rarely punished. Marriages were arranged without consent, and women were valued mainly for their ability to bear children and labor for the household. Even noble women were not entirely safe, trapped in political marriages and surrounded by suspicion and gossip. For ordinary women, life inside a castle could feel like living in chains. Children, too, were not spared from hardship. While noble, children might learn to read, ride horses, and prepare for positions of power. The children of servants grew up in labor from the moment they could walk. Little boys worked as stable hands, carrying water and feeding animals, while little girls served as maids, cleaners, or nursemaids for noble children. Childhood, as we imagine it today, hardly existed. They worked, suffered, and often died young. Living inside a castle did not just exhaust the body, it crushed the spirit. Ordinary people lived under constant reminders of their low status. The sight of lavish banquets, golden goblets, and rich fabrics contrasted cruelly with their hunger and rags. They were witnesses to wealth, yet barred from it. Servants who brought food to the high table were not allowed to eat until the lords had finished, often forced to wait in silence while their stomachs growled. Resentment brewed, but fear kept it in check. Any sign of defiance could mean dismissal, exile, or worse. Many lived and died in obscurity, their names forgotten, their suffering unrecorded. To outsiders, castles looked like safe havens. But for ordinary people inside, safety was an illusion. During sieges, they were the first to suffer hunger, disease, and death. During outbreaks of plague, castle walls offered no protection, and when lords demanded more taxes or labor, it was these same ordinary people who paid the price. Castles existed to protect the powerful, not the poor. For the servants and peasants who lived within, the walls were as much a prison as they were a fortress. The history of castles often focuses on kings, lords, and knights. But the truth is, these figures were the minority. The majority of people within castle walls were the silent, invisible workers who held everything together. Without them, No feast could be served, no weapons repaired, no walls maintained, yet history rarely tells their stories. Their suffering, labor, and humanity were buried beneath tales of glory and conquest. And perhaps this is the greatest tragedy of all, the forgotten lives of ordinary men, women, and children who endured the dark side of medieval castle life. Chapter 2. Hidden rooms, escape tunnels, and the secrets within medieval castles were not only fortresses of stone and symbols of power, they were also riddled with secrets. Behind the thick walls, beyond the torchlit corridors, there existed a hidden world that most ordinary eyes never saw. Lords and architects carefully designed secret chambers, escape routes, and concealed passages, not for decoration, but for survival, control, and sometimes deception. To truly understand the dark side of castle life, we must look beyond the visible halls and into the shadows, into the places where secrets were kept, lives were hidden, and survival often depended on silence. Castles were constantly under threat. Raids, wars, rebellions, and sieges were part of medieval reality. Lords and rulers understood that strength was not just about armies and walls, but also about clever planning. Hidden rooms and tunnels provided more than luxury. They were lifelines. A lord could vanish in an instant, slipping away from assassins or enemy soldiers. A treasure could be concealed in places even loyal servants didn't know existed, and spies, prisoners, or unwanted guests could be hidden away, leaving no trace behind. Perhaps the most famous secret feature of castles were escape tunnels. These passages, often built during the earliest stages of construction, ran beneath walls and moats, emerging far from the castle grounds. Some led into forests, others to nearby villages or rivers. A besieged lord could use them to flee, while his soldiers fought and died at the walls. Sometimes small groups of riders could escape through these routes, carrying messages or seeking reinforcements, but these tunnels were not always safe. Many were cramped, dark, and filled with rats. In some cases they were flooded or collapsed after years of disuse. Soldiers who tried to use them during sieges risked suffocation or drowning in underground mud. The mystery of hidden chambers. Nautic. All secret spaces were meant for escape. Some were designed for concealment. Hidden chambers often lay behind false walls, inside towers, or beneath staircases. These rooms could serve many purposes. Treasury hiding spots, lords stored gold, jewels, and important documents away from greedy eyes. Refuges for nobles, women, children, or high-ranking guests might be hidden here during attacks. Prisons and torture chambers. In the darkest cases, these rooms were used to hold prisoners where screams could not be heard. Religious sanctuaries. Some castles contained hidden chapels, where forbidden rites or secret prayers could take place. For the servants who discovered them, these chambers seemed like something out of myth, places whispered about but never entered. The secrets of their use were carefully guarded, known only to lords and their most trusted men. Whispers of treachery. Of course, secrecy could cut both ways. Just as lords used hidden tunnels to flee, enemies often used them to infiltrate. Chronicles tell of sieges ending not with battering rams, but with betrayal. A servant, bribed or desperate, might reveal the location of a hidden passage to attackers. Some castles were taken without a single stone being broken, simply because someone guided enemy soldiers through an unguarded tunnel. In these moments, secrecy became a weakness rather than a strength, a reminder that trust was as dangerous as treachery. While the lords commissioned these hidden spaces, it was often the builders, masons, and certain trusted servants who actually knew where they were. To reveal their knowledge could mean death, but to keep it was both a privilege and a curse. A kitchen boy might grow up hearing rumors of a stairwell that led nowhere. A maid might notice a draft behind a wall. Yet to ask questions was dangerous. Curiosity in a castle was not seen as intelligence, but as suspicion. Servants were expected to work blindly, obeying orders without seeking truth. Those who knew too much often vanished, their silence ensured in the most permanent of ways. Not all secret rooms were practical. Some were built out of fear of spirits, curses, or divine punishment. Medieval people were deeply superstitious. Lords might order hidden shrines or altars, hoping to appease unseen forces. In some castles, legends grew around certain sealed doors or bricked-off passages. Servants whispered that these places were haunted, that ghosts of murdered prisoners or betrayed lovers roamed behind the walls. Whether true or not, such stories added to the atmosphere of dread that clung to castle life. Castles were also places of vice and corruption. Hidden rooms provided the perfect setting for secret romances, affairs, and even crimes. A lord might use them to meet a mistress in secrecy, away from his wife and the church's eyes. Priests who should have been holy men sometimes used hidden chambers for greed or lustful indulgence. These secrets rarely saw daylight. Servants who discovered them knew better than to speak. Silence was survival. In the dark side of castle life, hidden spaces became tools not just of war, but of sin. From the outside, castles projected unshakable power. Their walls seemed impenetrable, their towers unscalable. Yet inside, lords relied on secrecy to protect themselves. If their walls were truly strong, why build escape tunnels? If their authority was unquestioned, why hide treasure or lovers? In truth, hidden rooms and escape tunnels revealed the weakness at the heart of castle life. They showed that fear, not confidence, ruled behind those walls. Lords trusted stone, but never fully trusted people, and so secrecy became their shield even against their own households. Over centuries, many of these passages and chambers were forgotten, their entrances sealed, their purposes lost. Archaeologists still uncover them today. Narrow corridors leading nowhere, bricked-up doorways behind walls, underground vaults filled with dust. Each discovery is a reminder that medieval castles were not simply monuments of stone, but labyrinths of human fear, ambition, and deception. The secrets hidden in those walls whisper of a world where trust was dangerous, loyalty was fragile, and safety was never certain. Conclusion: the shadows within the walls. Life in a castle was more than banquets and battles. It was a life lived under suspicion, a world where secrets mattered as much as swords. Hidden rooms and tunnels remind us that even the mightiest lords lived in fear of enemies, of betrayal, of scandal, of death. For ordinary people, these spaces were things of rumor and terror. For lords, they were the difference between survival and destruction. And for history, they remain haunting reminders that the true story of castles lies not in the sunlight of the courtyards, but in the shadows within the walls. Chapter 3: Hidden. Chambers, escape tunnels, and secrets castles concealed. If the walls of medieval castles could talk, they would whisper stories that history books only hint at. Beyond the great halls and the battlements, beyond the bustling kitchens and draughty chambers, lay a hidden world, an architectural labyrinth of secrets. These fortresses were not just symbols of power, they were puzzles deliberately designed to confuse, to conceal, and to protect. And within their stone hearts, they hid the darkest truths. The purpose of hidden chambers. Hidden chambers served multiple purposes. Some were designed as storerooms for treasure, gold coins, jewels, and valuable manuscripts that rulers wanted far from prying eyes. Others had far more sinister uses, secret prisons where enemies of the Lord, or sometimes inconvenient family members, were locked away, never to be seen again. There are accounts of castle cellars with false walls, where prisoners were kept in conditions so horrid that death came quickly. But not all hidden chambers were about cruelty. Some were sanctuaries. Nobles sometimes built concealed chapels, where they could pray in solitude or plot in secrecy. Others constructed intimate meeting rooms behind false doors, ideal for whispering political schemes or engaging in forbidden romances. Escape tunnels, a last resort. No medieval castle was truly invincible. Siege warfare made sure of that. A castle might withstand months of attack, but if supplies dwindled or walls were breached, there needed to be an alternative. Thus, the escape tunnel was born. These passages, often running under the ground for hundreds of meters, allowed the nobility a discreet path out. They typically emerged in a forest, a riverbank, or even the cellars of nearby villages. To attackers, these tunnels were nearly impossible to detect unless a traitor revealed them. Many castles in England, Germany, and Eastern Europe still preserve the remains of such tunnels, sometimes discovered centuries later by accident. Of course, not everyone was lucky enough to use these hidden routes. In most cases, the tunnels were reserved for the ruling family and their closest retainers. Ordinary guards or servants were left behind to face the conquerors. The dark side of secrecy. Secrets, however, come with dangers. Hidden chambers could also become traps. There are chilling legends of nobles who lured rivals or unsuspecting guests into a concealed room, only to lock them inside forever. In some castles, there are blocked doorways that lead to nowhere, their purpose lost to history. Were they unfinished constructions, or were they burial chambers for those who crossed the wrong lord? Historians believe that some escape tunnels doubled as smuggling routes. Wealthy lords eager to evade taxes or trade restrictions used these underground passages to transport goods like spices, wine, or even weapons. Thus, castles weren't just fortresses. They were hubs of illicit trade protected by secrecy. To design these hidden spaces required remarkable skill. Builders worked in silence, often sworn to secrecy, and in some cases executed afterward to ensure they never revealed the castle's vulnerabilities. The paranoia of medieval lords cannot be underestimated. They trusted few, and betrayal was always a looming shadow. In France, Château de Chinon is said to contain miles of underground passages. In Scotland, Edinburgh Castle hides a network of secret chambers beneath its rocky hill. And in Germany, Burg Reinstein preserved legends of hidden rooms filled with cursed objects left untouched for centuries. Legends and ghostly whispers, stories, passed down from generation to generation, tell of hidden chambers that are haunted. Servants whispered about footsteps in sealed corridors, or faint voices echoing through stone. Some castles became associated with curses. Anyone who opened a sealed passage was doomed to misfortune. Whether these tales were true or exaggerated, they reinforced the idea that castles were not just military structures, they were mysterious, almost living organisms, filled with secrets no one dared uncover. Chapter 4. Wealth and Misery. The gap between nobles and commoners. Medieval castles were not only military fortresses, but also symbols of staggering inequality. Behind the grandeur of high towers and banquet halls lay a world divided into two extremes, the opulence of the ruling class and the grinding poverty of those who served them. For the lords, ladies, and their families, life inside the castle could be dazzling. Great halls were decorated with tapestries designed not only to impress guests, but also to insulate against the cold stone walls. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced dishes, and imported wines, luxuries that only the wealthiest could afford. Entertainment was constant: tournaments, feasts, music from minstrels, and storytelling by candlelight. A noble child could expect an education in etiquette, hunting, and sometimes even languages. They wore furs, silks, and jewelry that displayed wealth as much as power. To an outsider, it might have seemed like paradise. But this glittering world was built upon the suffering of others. the harsh reality of servants and peasants. For the peasants who lived around the castle and the servants who worked within it, life was grueling. They endured endless labor, hauling water, cleaning chamber pots, tending fires, cooking meals, and maintaining the lord's estate. Servants lived in cramped, drafty quarters, often sleeping on straw, while disease spread quickly among them. Most were bound by duty and law. They could not simply walk away, as feudal obligations tied them to their lords. Even those who lived outside the castle walls owed heavy taxes and a share of their harvests, leaving their families with barely enough to survive. The gap in diet, one of the most visible differences between rich and poor, was food. Nobles feasted on pork, venison, fish, and exotic spices imported from the East. They enjoyed fresh bread made from fine white flour, sweetened pastries, and barrels of wine. Peasants, in contrast, subsisted mostly on bread made from coarse grains, pottage, a thin vegetable stew, and whatever they could gather, turnips, beans, or, in hard times, even acorns and grass. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or taken as leftovers from noble tables. The irony was brutal. The very peasants who produced food for their lords often starved in the shadows of the castle. Living conditions, stone versus straw wile. Nobles had rooms with fireplaces, decorated beds, and even primitive forms of privacy. Servants and peasants had little more than rough shelters. In winter, peasants often brought animals inside their homes for warmth, making sickness a constant companion. Castles themselves were uncomfortable for most inhabitants. Drafts seeped through stone walls, chambers smelled of smoke and refuse, and vermin infested nearly every corner. The wealthy at least had some comforts, but for everyone else, survival was a daily struggle, power and dependence. The gap between classes was not just about wealth, but also about power. Nobles depended on peasants to sustain them, yet peasants depended on nobles for protection. During sieges or raids, villagers would flee to the castle, cramming into its walls. For many, this meant trading their freedom for safety, reinforcing the cycle of dependence and control. Some lords exploited this mercilessly, imposing harsh taxes or demanding labor far beyond what peasants could give. Others were more benevolent, providing food during famine or showing leniency. But one fact remained unshakable. Castles stood as monuments to the suffering of the many for the luxury of the few, world of contrasts. Walking through a medieval castle, the contrasts would have been startling. In one hall, lords dined on gold plates, their laughter echoing off the walls. Just a few corridors away, servants collapsed from exhaustion, and peasants outside the gates struggled to survive winter. It was not just stone and mortar that built castles, it was inequality itself. Without the labor and sacrifice of countless peasants, these fortresses of wealth and power could never have existed. Chapter 5. Filth, Disease, and the Horrors of Castle. Hygiene. Medieval castles, for all their grandeur and stone fortifications, were anything but clean. The gleaming images of knights and noble banquets hide a much more unpleasant reality. Life behind castle walls was rife with filth, vermin, and disease, a daily battle for health and survival, even for the wealthiest inhabitants. Unlike modern standards, medieval castles had minimal sanitation systems. Toilets were often little more than simple holes in the walls, known as garderobes, which emptied directly into the moat or a cesspit. The moat itself, imagined as a pristine barrier against invaders, often became a contaminated water source. Waste mixed with rain and debris, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. Drinking water was another hazard. Wells were frequently contaminated, and water drawn from moats or nearby rivers was unsafe. Even the nobility, with access to filtered water, often fell ill from contaminated sources. The lack of sanitation and crowded conditions made castles perfect incubators for disease. Lice and fleas thrived in bedding, clothing, and on the bodies of the inhabitants. Rats, attracted by food scraps and waste, carried deadly diseases, such as the bubonic plague. Accounts from the 14th century describe castles during plague outbreaks. Entire families perished, servants collapsed at their posts, and nobles retreated to their private chambers in terror, yet few were safe. Even minor illnesses could quickly turn fatal without proper medical care, which was primitive at best. Cooking in castles was also hazardous. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and filthy. Meat was stored unrefrigerated, often covered in flies, and spices were used not to enhance flavor, but to mask the stench of decay. Utensils were rarely cleaned properly, and shared plates meant that germs spread easily. Servants handled food while simultaneously tending to waste removal, cleaning, or carrying heavy loads, exposing themselves to pathogens constantly. Eating safely was a luxury reserved for the lords, while everyone else risked infection daily. Personal hygiene was limited. Regular bathing was uncommon, often only during religious observances or special occasions. Clothing was worn for weeks, sometimes months without washing. Fabrics were infested with lice and fleas, which caused irritation, disease, and social stigma. Even the nobility suffered. Their wealth protected them from extreme hunger, but they could not escape lice, fleas, or the foul smells of crowded stone halls. The concept of cleanliness in medieval castles was vastly different from today's standards. Living amid filth and disease had more than physical consequences. It also wore on the mind. Constant exposure to waste, rats, and sickness instilled fear and anxiety. Servants who handled waste or cleaned floors risked punishment if they made a mistake, all while knowing that illness could strike at any time. The oppressive conditions reinforced social hierarchies. Nobles could retreat into private chambers and avoid direct contact with waste, while servants endured the most degrading and dangerous tasks. This separation heightened both the power of the ruling class and the suffering of the lower classes. Medical understanding was extremely limited. Illnesses were often attributed to miasmas, curses, or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to bloodletting, sometimes making the patient worse. Outbreaks of plague or dysentery could decimate a castle population within weeks. Doctors were few and rarely available to common servants. When plague struck, the survival of ordinary people depended more on luck than skill. Nobles might have physicians, but even they were not immune to disease, showing that wealth offered comfort but not guaranteed safety. Rats were everywhere, in kitchens, halls, and even bedrooms. They gnawed through food, carried disease, and terrified inhabitants. Fleas jumped from rats to humans, transmitting deadly pathogens. Some chroniclers describe rats so large they could gnaw through clothing, creating constant fear and discomfort. Vermin wasn't limited to rodents. Insects, lice, and other pests were endemic, and their presence was simply tolerated as part of castle life. The physical discomfort combined with disease risk created a daily struggle for survival for the majority of castle inhabitants. History tends to focus on battles, treaties, and noble families. The grim realities of castle hygiene, disease, and suffering often went unrecorded. Yet accounts from chronicles, letters, and archaeological evidence paint a stark picture. Castles were filthy, dangerous, and cruel places for ordinary people. Even in the greatest halls adorned with gold and tapestries, the stench of filth lingered. Even in private chambers, the threat of illness never fully disappeared. Life inside castles was a constant balancing act, surviving disease, avoiding punishment, and enduring conditions that modern people would find unimaginable. Conclusion: the dark side of castle life was not limited to fear and intrigue. It included filth, disease, and daily horrors that affected every human being living behind those stone walls. The grandeur of a castle might impress outsiders, but for those inside, the especially servants and peasants, life was harsh, dangerous, and often deadly. In the next chapter, we will explore court intrigues and betrayals, revealing just how treacherous castle life could be for everyone, from lords to the humblest servant. Chapter 6. Court Intrigues and Betrayal Stories, Medieval. Castles were not just fortresses of stone, they were fortresses of secrets, deception, and human ambition. Behind the thick walls, beneath the grandeur of banquet halls, countless plots and betrayals unfolded. Power, wealth, and survival intertwined in dangerous ways, making the life of a noble, and sometimes even a servant, fraught with peril. Every castle was a microcosm of politics. Lords competed for influence, married for alliances, and sought to expand their wealth and territories. But within the walls, these ambitions often took darker forms. Alliances shifted quickly, and loyalty was never guaranteed. A trusted knight could suddenly conspire with a rival lord. A lady-in-waiting might betray her mistress to gain favor or wealth. Servants, too, were not immune. Some traded secrets for safety or bribes. In such an environment, trust was a dangerous commodity. One of the most notorious aspects of castle intrigue was the use of poison. A rival might quietly slip a lethal dose into a wine cup, ending the life of a powerful noble without the noise of open combat. Historians record countless instances where entire dynasties were threatened by silent assassins. Even within families, betrayal was common. Brothers schemed against brothers, uncles against nephews, and wives against husbands. A single misplaced word or suspicious glance could have fatal consequences. Many castles contained hidden rooms specifically designed to trap or punish enemies, making treachery both convenient and terrifying. Hidden chambers and secret corridors played a key role in intrigue. Noble conspirators could meet in secret, away from prying eyes and suspicious servants. Messages were passed through intermediaries, coded letters were exchanged, and spies roamed the corridors. The consequences of discovery were severe. Conspirators faced execution, exile, or imprisonment. Yet despite the danger, the game of political maneuvering was relentless. Power, after all, was worth the risk. Women in medieval castles were often perceived as powerless, but many wielded influence through subtlety and cunning. Queens, duchesses, and noblewomen orchestrated alliances, protected their children's inheritance, and sometimes plotted against husbands or rivals. Court gossip, secret correspondence, and patronage networks allowed women to manipulate events behind the scenes. Some became famous for their cunning, using charm and intelligence to survive and thrive in a male-dominated world. Yet failure could be deadly. Imprisonment, scandal, or even death awaited those who miscalculated. Ordinary people, especially servants, played critical roles in castle intrigues. They overheard conversations, carried messages, and sometimes leaked information to rival factions. Their knowledge made them both valuable and dangerous. Some servants used this to their advantage, trading secrets for protection, food, or favor. Others were coerced or intimidated, becoming unwilling participants in schemes beyond their control. In the shadows of the castle, even the lowliest inhabitant could affect the balance of power. Banquets were not just for enjoyment. They were stages for political maneuvering. Lords could observe allies and rivals, test loyalty, and even stage subtle threats or insults. A misplaced toast, a seemingly casual comment, or an overlooked gesture could spark quarrels or reveal hidden agendas. In some cases, feasts were used to eliminate rivals under the guise of hospitality. The walls that gleamed with candlelight and tapestries often concealed poison, knives, and secret compartments designed for sudden violence. History is full of dramatic betrayals that took place within castles. For example, in England, the intrigues of the Wars of the Roses saw family members plotting against one another, leading to imprisonment or execution. In France, the Château de Chinon witnessed secret political maneuvers that altered the fate of the kingdom. Across Europe, castles served as stages for both ambition and tragedy. These betrayals were not always grand political moves. Many were personal. Lovers, siblings, and trusted confidants could turn on one another for money, status, or revenge. The constant presence of danger shaped every decision, every conversation, and every alliance within the castle. Living amidst constant intrigue imposed a heavy psychological burden. Nobles were always alert, never fully trusting anyone, even family. The threat of assassination, betrayal, or public humiliation was ever present. Servants lived under similar pressures, balancing obedience with survival. Fear was woven into the fabric of daily life, influencing behavior, decisions, and even relationships. This culture of suspicion ensured that castles were not only militarily fortified, but emotionally fortified as well. Walls and moats protected bodies, while secrecy and paranoia protected reputations and lives. Conclusion. A world built on fear and deception, court intrigues, and betrayals reveal that medieval castles were far more than stone fortresses. They were arenas of human ambition, where wealth, power, and survival dictated every action. Trust was rare, and loyalty was often temporary. For lords, ladies, and servants alike, life inside these walls required constant vigilance, cleverness, and sometimes ruthlessness. The dark side of castle life was not only physical, hunger, disease, and filth, but psychological. Fear, suspicion, and treachery were constant companions, shaping every decision and interaction. The history of castles, then, is as much about human nature and ambition as it is about stone, steel, and battlements. And behind the grandeur and legend lies a world of shadows, secrets, and silent suffering that few ever fully understood. Chapter 7. Reflections on the Dark Side of Castle. Medieval castles were marvels of architecture, engineering, and artistry. Towering stone walls, intricate battlements, and grand halls continue to inspire awe today. Yet behind the grandeur lay a world far darker than most history books reveal. To truly understand castles, one must look past the shining armor of knights and the flowing gowns of nobles and into the shadows, into a life of suffering, secrecy, and fear. Castles were worlds of extremes. On one side were the lords and ladies, enjoying comfort, wealth, and influence. On the other were the ordinary people, servants, peasants, and laborers, who endured filth, hunger, disease, and abuse. Their labor sustained the entire castle, yet their voices were rarely recorded in history. This stark contrast shaped every aspect of castle life: what people ate, how they slept, the work they performed, and even the risks they faced. The walls that protected the wealthy often imprisoned the poor. Safety, warmth, and food were privileges, not rights. Hidden chambers, escape tunnels, and secret passages illustrate how fear governed the lives of everyone in the castle. Lords hid treasure, lovers, and enemies alike, while servants learned to navigate whispers and secrets to survive. These features highlight a fundamental truth. Castles were built not just for defense, but for control. Secrecy served as both protection and manipulation. The more a lord concealed, the more power they wielded. But the very act of hiding also revealed weakness, fear of betrayal, death, or failure. In this way, the shadows within castles were as telling as the towering battlements themselves. The opulence of noble life came at a steep human cost. Peasants labored endlessly to produce food, maintain walls, and craft tools and weapons. Servants endured exhausting work, disease, and filth, while their masters dined on delicacies and slept in heated chambers. This imbalance was not accidental, it was structural. The medieval feudal system depended on inequality, power, and wealth, concentrated at the top, while survival and labor burdened the majority. Castles were symbols of might, but also monuments to human suffering. Beyond physical hardships, the mental toll was immense. Servants lived under the constant threat of punishment, disease, or sudden death. Nobles, though wealthier, were not free from fear of assassination, betrayal, or political collapse. The castle's stone walls, thick doors, and guards could protect bodies, but never fully shield minds. Suspicion, paranoia, and dread shaped every interaction. Fear became a currency of power, guiding relationships and decisions. Court intrigues and betrayals reveal that castles were as much about human psychology as architecture. Power struggles, secret plots, and conspiracies were not anomalies. They were a way of life. Everyone, from the lord to the lowliest servant, navigated a delicate balance of loyalty, deception, and survival. These stories remind us that castles were not static monuments, but dynamic spaces shaped by ambition, greed, and human desire. Behind the beauty of the halls lay strategy, manipulation, and sometimes cruelty, hidden forces that often dictated life and death. History remembers kings, knights, and battles, yet the majority of people who lived in castles, servants, peasants, and laborers, remained invisible. Their suffering, resilience, and labor are often footnotes in the story of medieval power. Understanding the dark side of castle life is not merely a lesson in architecture or history. It is a tribute to those who endured hardship silently. Every stone wall, every hidden chamber, and every banquet table owed its existence to them. Today, medieval castles fascinate us with their beauty, strategy, and history. But it is essential to remember that these monuments also reflect human inequality, fear, and ambition. Their stones tell stories of glory, but also of suffering. Their towers reach high into the sky, but their shadows remain deep below. By exploring the hidden truths, filth, disease, labor, secrecy, and betrayal, we gain a more complete understanding of medieval life. Castles were not only homes or fortresses. They were microcosms of society itself, reflecting both the best and worst of human nature. The dark side of medieval castles reveals a world where survival, secrecy, and power dictated life. They were spaces of wonder and horror, opulence and suffering, strategy, and fear. Behind the grandeur lay the stories of countless forgotten people whose lives were shaped by the walls that now inspire awe. To fully appreciate the history of castles, we must see beyond the myths and the romance. We must acknowledge the hidden truths, the untold suffering, and the shadowed lives that made these stone fortresses possible. Only then can we understand the medieval world in all its complexity.